Diogenes, the cynic, the philosopher who challenged society. In the vast and intricate history of ancient philosophy, certain individuals stand out not merely because of their intellectual prowess or philosophical insight, but because of their unyielding rejection of societal norms. These figures were not afraid to stand against the prevailing culture of their time, challenging everything from the pursuit of wealth to the importance of power. Diogenes of Sinope, one of the most radical thinkers of the ancient world, was one such individual. Diogenes wasn't simply a philosopher in the traditional sense. He was a living, breathing critique of everything that the ancient world held dear. His approach to life was not through debates in grand halls or written treatises, but through action, through a life lived out loud and without apology. He chose to embody his philosophy, often in ways that shocked and even scandalized those around him. He was a true embodiment of the word cynic, a term that today has negative connotations, but, in the context of Diogenes, signified a philosophy grounded in simplicity, honesty, and freedom from societal constraints. In a time when philosophy was often a pursuit of the intellectual elite, Diogenes stood out as a philosopher of the people. He rejected the luxuries of life, choosing instead to live in total poverty. He owned nothing, needed nothing, and cared nothing for the social structures of his time. Diogenes was a man who sought freedom not through wealth or status, but through complete independence from society's expectations. And his life, filled with seemingly strange behaviors and eccentric acts, continues to challenge and inspire people to think differently about the pursuit of happiness and the nature of human existence. The early life of Diogenes. From privilege to poverty. Diogenes was born around 412 BCE in Sinope, a Greek colony on the Black Sea. His father, Hysizius, was a wealthy banker, and it's likely that Diogenes' early life was one of comfort and privilege. He would have had access to the best education of the time, learning from the leading intellectuals and philosophers. However, this comfortable life did not last long. At some point, likely due to his father's involvement in a financial scandal, Diogenes found himself exiled from Sinope. Some sources suggest that his father was involved in the debasement of coinage, a crime that led to both their banishment. Whatever the exact cause, Diogenes was suddenly thrust into a life of uncertainty and hardship. It was during this period of exile that Diogenes experienced what would become the central theme of his philosophy: the rejection of material wealth and social status. Instead of trying to rebuild his life in another city, Diogenes made a radical choice. He rejected the very foundations of society: wealth, power, and social position, and chose to live as simply as possible. He went from living in luxury to living with almost nothing at all. This transformation was not merely an external change. It was a profound philosophical shift, one that would define the rest of his life. The birth of the Cynic philosopher. Upon arriving in Athens, Diogenes sought out Antisthenes, a former disciple of Socrates, who had founded the Cynic school of philosophy. Antisthenes preached that virtue was the only true good, and that true happiness could only be found through living a life of self-sufficiency and simplicity. Diogenes quickly became a devoted follower of Antisthenes, and his interpretation of Cynicism became even more radical than that of his teacher. Where Antisthenes taught the value of living simply, Diogenes took this to its extreme. He rejected any and all material possessions, preferring to live on the streets and in public places. He famously lived in a large ceramic jar, or tub, in the middle of Athens, and he often begged for food, not out of necessity, but as a demonstration of his complete rejection of the material world. Diogenes was not content with simply rejecting materialism. He also sought to challenge societal norms, especially those that dictated how people should behave. He despised the pretensions of the wealthy and powerful, and sought to expose the hypocrisy of those who claimed to live virtuous lives while indulging in luxury and excess. In his eyes, the true path to virtue was through rejecting all the trappings of civilization, the wealth, power, and status that most people spent their lives pursuing. Radical simplicity. Living the Cynic philosophy. Diogenes' lifestyle was a direct expression of his Cynic philosophy. He lived in a state of total simplicity, eschewing not only material possessions, but also the social expectations placed upon him. For Diogenes, virtue was not something that could be learned through books or intellectual discussion. It had to be lived. He would often engage in acts of extreme behavior to demonstrate the futility of societal norms. One of his most famous stunts was his encounter with Plato, the great Athenian philosopher. When Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it into Plato's academy, declaring, "Here is Plato's man." This act was meant to show the absurdity of philosophical definitions that ignored the practical realities of life. Diogenes was a master of provocation. He would walk the streets of Athens in the middle of the day with a lit lantern, claiming to be looking for an honest man. This was a direct challenge to the people around him, as if to say, if you think you are virtuous, prove it. In an age where appearances were everything, Diogenes made a mockery of the obsession with outward appearances and social status. The iconoclast. Exposing the hypocrisy of society. Diogenes did not limit his critiques to intellectuals and philosophers. He took aim at the wealthy, the powerful, and even the religious institutions of his time. One of his most famous critiques of wealth came during a visit to the luxurious home of a rich man. The man offered him a meal, and Diogenes, instead of politely accepting, grabbed a handful of figs and began eating them, saying, "If you give me a meal, I'll eat it. If not, I'll just take it." He also made a mockery of religious rituals. In one instance, he interrupted a religious festival by urinating in the temple, pointing out that the gods, who supposedly ruled the world, had no power over the basic instincts of human beings. For Diogenes, these rituals were mere symbol-empty gestures that did nothing to address the real concerns of human existence. Diogenes and Alexander the Great. The ultimate act of defiance. One of the most famous stories about Diogenes involves his encounter with Alexander the Great. Alexander, who had conquered much of the known world and was on the verge of becoming the most powerful man in history, heard of the philosopher's eccentric lifestyle and decided to pay him a visit. When Alexander arrived, he found Diogenes lying in the sun, seemingly uninterested in the presence of the king. Alexander, amused and intrigued, offered Diogenes anything he wished, asking, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Without hesitation, Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The response was stunning. Here was a man who, in the face of the most powerful ruler in the world, wanted nothing more than to be left alone to bask in the warmth of the sun. Alexander, deeply impressed by Diogenes' independence and audacity, famously remarked, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." This encounter perfectly encapsulated Diogenes' philosophy. True power does not lie in wealth, military conquest, or political influence. Instead, it lies in the ability to live without needing anything from others and to remain true to oneself, no matter the circumstances. The legacy of Diogenes. A radical philosophy for the ages. Diogenes' life and philosophy were radical in every sense of the word. He rejected all the conventions of his time, wealth, power, status, and instead lived a life of extreme simplicity. He sought to free himself from the shackles of societal expectations, and in doing so, he challenged the very foundations of the world around him. But Diogenes' philosophy was not just about rejecting society. It was about living in accordance with nature, with virtue, and with truth. He sought to strip away the layers of artificiality that people had built around themselves and get to the core of what it meant to live a good life. Though Diogenes lived over 2,000 years ago, his ideas continue to resonate today. In a world that often seems obsessed with wealth, status, and the pursuit of power, Diogenes reminds us that true happiness and freedom come not from what we own or who we know, but from how we live. His legacy lives on as a symbol of radical authenticity and self-reliance. In many ways, Diogenes was ahead of his time. His life was a statement against the consumerism, hypocrisy, and empty rituals that still plague modern society. He stands as a reminder that, in a world that often prioritizes superficial success, the true measure of a person's worth lies not in their possessions or their accomplishments, but in their ability to live authentically and with integrity.